Boom. Right. So, who are you and what do you do?
My name is Eli Nichols. I've got Oystercatcher Sea Farms, and I'm an oyster farmer on the Chesapeake Bay.
Fantastic. And where are we today?
So today, we're actually right off Poison Creek, located in Whitestone, Virginia.
And what's the historical context of this place?
So this is kind of the first area where John Smith came into the Chesapeake region and started exploring and finding different areas of Virginia.
Nice. So you were telling me something about that, right? Like it was right across the water?
Yeah, so as of right now, where we are, we're on the end of Windmill Point, which is right on the other side of the Rappahannock River. And on the corresponding side is Deltaville, which is, legend has it, when John Smith first came into Chesapeake Bay, he was injured by a stingray on Stingray Point, which is now Deltaville. Native Americans, legend has it, Native Americans brought him over to Poison Creek, which is where we're now located today, and gave him a remedy from the waterway, so more or less revived him, with the oysters. And the brand that I've kind of created for my oyster company is the Revival Oyster. And so that's kind of like the brand that I've kind of created, particularly special to this area, I guess.
Yeah. And what is the story then with the revival, and the history to the present of, I guess, the revival of oysters?
Yeah, and so that kind of also, when I came up with that name, I was also thinking about, I took over a pre-existing oyster farm and kind of made it my own, as well as, we're also in this resurgence of Chesapeake Bay as far as the oyster population coming back, and then almost like revival of the bay itself.
And they're fitting in. Well, and then some of that too is and we'll dive into the specifics, I think, of what oyster farming is.
Right.
But for right now too, though, in terms of the sustainability practice, how do the sustainable practices of oyster farming contribute to the marine health here in the Rappahannock?
Well, yeah. So, I actually work with a couple different partners as far as doing shell restoration programs. But mainly, the oyster itself is probably one of the most sustainable proteins we can actually produce or cultivate. And, that's because they're a filter feeder. They actually can uptake to about 50 gallons of water per animal, and so we're growing them by the millions. So when we put that many animals in an area, you can filter the water fairly quickly. Not to mention the cage grow out methods we use also brings in all types of fish fauna. So a lot of times when we pull up one of these cages, you'll find 10 different species of finfish living with the oysters itself.
And then can you give kind of if you can, an overview too, maybe not just what you do as well, but just so people can understand what oyster farming versus oyster fishing, or what is it?
Yeah, so traditionally when you think oysters, right, you think of, them coming right off the bottom in a river or bay, and, the method of harvest is typically by dredge or tongs or something like that. And, that's all good. But it's also, when you're talking about that, you're talking about wild stocks of the oyster. And so with oyster farming, we're actually able to take the same animal, same species, same genus, everything that is the wild oyster we have here in Virginia, which is Crossostrea virginica, or American oyster. But we kind of have more control of the animal because we're taking spat or baby oysters at, as small as we can get it, about, a millimeter in size. And from that point, we do simple husbandry as far as grading it on different screens, and that allows the animal to have uniform shape throughout the whole life history. But mainly it starts in tanks, and from that we get the actual baby oyster seed. So a million looks like about the size of a softball. And then it's crazy to think about because then it grows into metric tons of oysters.
Yeah.
And so from that point, we have these land-based tanks, and we're doing simple husbandry as far as sizing them on different grades. And then as the animal gets larger, we put them into different grow-out bags, which in turn allows the animal to be in, its own little spot, more or less consolidated to density size. So a bag of babies could have, 5,000 oysters in one bag, versus a market bag might have only 200.
Okay.
And, that process of us cutting down the density is just over its, 12 to 14 month lifespan.
And build.
Yeah, exactly.
So in terms of, take me through it is condensed as possible without leaving out anything important,
Of
but
course.
as condensed as possible, what is farming for you? Like in terms of, we see the boat behind you too, and I see the cages, and I see this like shelf of oysters,
Right.
other bags over here. So what is farming for you?
So for me particularly, I do everything off bottom, which means I have these cages I have in the background. They have little legs on them. And roughly when they're actually on the bay floor, on the substrate there, they sit about 12 to 14 inches off the bottom. And that just allows the animals to have, nice, good flow through. So they're allowed to, any available food that's coming through them as far as available. When I say available food, I say like phytoplankton and macroalgae, stuff like that, and as that pretty much the oysters will be sitting in these cages, and then with the different tides come through, that brings in more dissolved oxygen, more food. So they're kind of just sitting on like a buffet line, essentially just able to feed as they will.
And then what do you end up doing too? Like in terms of going out, like how long do you leave them?
Yeah. And so I try to, everything. So the whole process from seed to finish is about 18 months, give or take. And with competition in the cages, you might see animals reach maturity of market size in 12 months sometimes, or even faster. But, our job as farmers is to, cycle through all the cages, as well as, mainly reduce the density of the cages so the animals have, available room to grow as large as they want, as well as, have enough food. So that way they're kind of all more uniform as far as shape and size and cup and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And for, I'm primarily grow oysters for the half shell market. And, meaning that the oysters are eaten on the half shell raw. So typically the size of them is anywhere from 3 to 4 inches typically.
And then in terms of, you talked about it a little bit too, in terms of them being filters. And I'm fascinated by that too. You're saying, what was it, 50 gallons?
50 gallons, yeah.
A minute? A what?
Per day.
Per day. That makes more sense.
Yeah. So like, if you look over here, you can see the water's so clear, and that's typically, versus off the other side, which is much more murky. And I've kind of planted about 100 bushels of shell just right in here. And over the years, the wild oysters have adhered to that. And now I've got almost like a little reef going right here.
It's fascinating to me too. You're in the verbiage though, but like you saying like, I'm gonna grab some real quick.
Yeah.
You saying something like, and I planted.
You grab that water too, actually.
Oh, yeah. Where's the guy? Oh my God. Yeah. You saying like I planted them here. So it's funny, the ag terminology.
Oh yeah. And then, it's, I say spat, but every farmer refers to their baby oysters as seed,
Oh, they do? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just going to pour this down because I'm scared.
But then, for the grow out, as far as, farming practices go, they're essentially animals that don't move, So I would always refer to it as like sea ranching, because we're putting these animals in the cage. We're reducing the density per the pen, as they get larger, so they can have plenty of food and grow uniform.
Now, you guys don't have the same conversations though, too, in terms of like animal welfare. Like, what is animal welfare considered in the oyster industry?
I don't even know how to answer that.
But we talk about that with livestock and other things like that, and it's like, oh, we put them in cages. It's not like,
it doesn't have a central nervous system. They're not like, technically vegans could eat oysters, right?
Yeah,
because they don't produce a backbone, and they don't have a brain and all this kind of stuff.
Oh, I didn't know that was the drawing line.
I always thought that. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, but in terms of like, is there a big difference between, I guess, free range, the wild ones, versus these ones that are being farmed, or do people consider there to be the different?
Yeah, like typically when you think of a wild oyster, you think of a big meaty oyster that's 4 to 6 inches, and it's like a steak pretty much when you shuck it and eat it. But typically now the trend, and oyster used to be a food of the people, right? It used to be the most available food, just like lobsters, and now it's become like a white tablecloth kind of experience, I guess.
It used to be prison food, actually. Crabs and lobsters and crabs used to be.
Yeah.
And it's funny seeing the fashion of food and how it changes over time. So it is funny too, like a bottom feeder in a sense.
Oh yeah.
Right. And how much that got elevated. But I want to stay on that for a little bit though too, just in terms of that filtration. So for the Chesapeake Bay, what role have oysters been playing in that revitalization?
So historically, Chesapeake Bay was, when John Smith first came, legend has it, when he first came into Chesapeake Bay, the water was unnavigable almost because of how much biomass of oyster shells were actually present. And, it didn't take many years, pretty much by the 1800s, we had kind of already hit that so hard that, and for the most, it's actually Chesapeake Bay, some other names are like Great Shellfish Bay. And, and that's because it literally is a vast, large watershed that typically is fairly shallow. And so these oysters reefs essentially were sticking out of the water when they first came in here. And then over time, with not having any restriction on harvesting and just the demand of, it's a viable food source when we, everything first started happening around here. And so then they, pretty much since the 1880s, oysters have been overfished, wild stocks.
Right.
And then, but as far as like the beneficial aspects of it for filtration, back when there was that much biomass in the Chesapeake Bay, the bay itself, the whole watershed could purge itself out in 3 to 5 days. Versus now we're talking like months or something,
Well, how has that contributed to like shoreline protection or just any other programs that happen out here?
Yeah. So, and that, the idea is that, the more oysters in the water, the better water quality, pretty much. And then, as far as like, that's another reason why I've been experimenting with planting all this shell along my shoreline here to see how it improves it. And it definitely is, keeping it together as far as strong and everything like that, not having as much erosion as it would be with just having blank sand bottom. And, we're right on a creek that doesn't have any type of wake zone or anything. So any boat, prevailing wind, anything like that hits me directly right here. So if it's blowing from the west, it comes right down the creek. If it's blowing northeast, it's coming right at us. And it's, and Windmill Point is kind of where we're at. And so the name hits itself. It's a very windy place, especially in the wintertime.
So for now too, what a general, I don't know if you know, but like where are the numbers at in terms of it used to be somewhere and then now it's, where it is now?
As far as like population and stuff like that? Yeah. So, God, millions of oysters in the Chesapeake Bay prior to us coming here and harvesting everything pretty much. But then prior to that, nowadays it's, the grounds or the commercial waterman grounds are rotational. So pretty much there's different partners, different state groups that will actually seed and monitor and, pick which area is going to be harvested next. And so typically it's on a rotational thing. So like say this one area gets planted and they allow that area to be, untouched and unharvested for about 3 to 4 years. And then they come back around and then harvest that area. So they create all these zones in Chesapeake Bay for the watermen. And, the idea is through the winter season for the oyster guys, they'll be hitting one area, but they hit it until like they reach their quota. And then they move on to another area. And that's how their replenishment is. And it's, it's tough because the demand of oysters is so high that it's like, you got to be planting nonstop to really get to the point where you can actually, have an area that's like, pristine and unkept, pretty much.
Yeah. And it's funny too, because there's so much going on right now with like restorative agricultural practices.
Yeah.
And so it's really funny that for me, at least, right, I do all stuff. It's so hard to get people to transition from conventional means of doing things to, do you feel like there's a new generation of oyster farmers? And by the way, I did ask already kind of, but what do you call yourselves?
Yeah, I will always refer to myself as an oyster farmer.
Well, you said, what was it, Sea Rancher?
Sea Rancher, oh yeah, that was kind of, no, that'll work too. Yeah, Sea Rancher works too.
But in terms of that industry, do you feel like there's a new generation and how are they looking at it differently than the previous?
Yeah, like I would say I came into it, I've been growing oysters for about 12 years now. I went to school at Humboldt State University for marine fisheries biology, and then kind of fell into the aspect of farming food and oysters specifically. So I started in Northern California, and I've kind of been all over the East Coast as far as where I've actually had my hands with oysters, down in South Carolina, down in Chesapeake Island, just across the bay there. All different areas, all different site selections, and like any farming practice, site selection is key, and for oyster farming specifically, you're going to look for areas of high flow, hard bottom, all things that makes it easier on the farmer itself to produce a good product, essentially.
Now, how different is it in different parts of the bay? Like, if you planted them here versus on the other side too, is it like wine in that way where you're going to get like a different taste for that side?
Of course, yeah. So, terroir is kind of what they refer to that on land, and it's, miroir for the water almost. Or that's what it's called, kind of. And it's just like the translation from, the flavor profile per the region of where the oysters are kind of grown, essentially. And so specifically here, we're a mid-base salinity. So we're right in the, salinities range from as far as, 5 parts per thousand to go as high as 33 parts per thousand, which is almost full-strength seawater. And at that point, you're talking really briny oysters. And, I'm right here in the middle, so I'm right around 15 to 18 parts per thousand. And that's why we have a nice mid-salinity oyster. And specifically to where we're growing, it finishes with a nice crisp mineral finish as well. So it's, it's a very well-balanced oyster. And, I think a lot of that has to do with just where we're located. So we are located on the western shores of Chesapeake Bay. So we're open to the actual Chesapeake Bay. That's why we get that nice brininess. But then we also have a lot of, if you walk out on the lease, barefoot, you'll feel these submerged aquifers. And that's where we're getting that nice mineral-rich flavor profile.
So the interesting thing, and by the way, I love learning new words. So I've never heard miroir.
Oh, yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, definitely use that.
100% now. But in terms of, when you were talking about the salinity factor, are those questions that like chefs will ask you? Like, what is your salinity? Like, what are questions people ask?
So typically, a chef, when you're, say if I'm trying to pitch an oyster to a chef, well, he's going to be, concerned about the size, the shape, how easy it is to shuck, but mainly the profile flavor. And, each, like, before we were saying that each area throughout the bay, throughout, Northeast, Southeast, California, West Coast, all that stuff, they have every region, I could grow an oyster in the 2 creeks down, it's going to taste slightly different than right here. And that's because a lot of times, the different macroalgae are blooming and stuff like that at different times. So it's going to create a different flavor profile. And the salinity is strictly associated with where you are as far as brackish water meets salt water. Here in the Chesapeake Bay, typically the salinity ranges from as high as 25, which is where you'd see, some salty oysters down towards like Virginia Beach or like Cape Charles area. And then, or Eastern Shore, Virginia, typically. And then, Western Shores and further up the bay, Rappahannock River, you're going to get more of a sweeter, buttery oyster kind of.
So can you keep doing that though? Like, can you explain like a couple of the, what is the flavor profiles in some of the areas of Virginia? How are they different? And how does that compare with the other coast, basically?
Yeah. So, so pretty much the oyster we predominantly grow here, pretty much the only oyster species we grow here in Virginia, in the Northeast and Southeast, is the American oyster, or Cross-Astrea virginica. And so that oyster is native to the whole area as far as, all the way down the Gulf of Mexico. And, that typically they're more on the organic kind of grassy side of flavor profile. But that will range up and down the coast. Like I said, here we're more of a crisp middle finish. And the salinity factor goes into like where you will actually be, there's a snake in the water, where you actually be, and as far as like how close you are to the ocean. That's the huge influx of like salinity and brininess goes. So like say, when I was living in Chesapeake Island, I was producing oysters there. It was the saltiest oyster you can probably get for an East Coast oyster.
Okay.
And that's because they're, we grow them on sandbars right on the little inlets of the Atlantic Ocean. And they're getting also the oysters there are like they grow pretty quickly just because of how fast, the water exchange is. So, if you think about it, there's also a higher tide differential too. So, the intertidal stuff will kind of also affect the flavor of the oyster sometimes. But then here, we were considered subtidal as far as which also kind of affects the whole practice of how you grow the oyster. Because then you're getting into different grow out techniques, different gear and stuff like that, depending on your bottom. Sometimes, like, I'm fortunate here, I have really firm sand bottom to finish my oysters on. And that means the cages don't really sink in at all. They're, able to
do well.
Exactly, yeah. Versus sometimes, like here in the creek, I've got about a few acres right here in Annapoisin, and it's more of a mud bottom. So there, that also has a different flavor profile with the oyster too.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me. So it is, and it is. Terroir is usually to grapes, right? As terroir is to oysters and a number of other things too. But I think especially, right, because it is that filtration. So whatever's there is really getting pulled in and taken out. So, and this is more of a macro question in some ways too. So I don't expect you to know the full history of it. Well, why do wineries like oysters so much? Why is wine and oysters paired so much?
Typically, so I work with, since I've started my business, I've also gone into the, direct to sales food route. As far as I've got a little, it's almost like a food truck kind of thing, but I work out of a tent. And, we have my setup and we have the oysters on display and we do like a small menu. But the idea is to do, farm to table aspect of that. And, typically the wineries, especially, as long as we have food coming to them, they're happy because that will bring more guests in. And, especially with oysters, it just naturally pairs well with wine, especially a white wine with, high minerality, all that kind of stuff. Like Vermentino, for instance, like any Vermentino, stuff like that goes really well with an oyster just because it kind of offsets the flavor profile with that nice kind of dry mineral aspect to it.
Yeah. And it's just always fascinating to be like cheese, charcuterie, and then it's just oysters, not seafood.
Yeah. Specifically oysters.
Yeah.
And two, I think a lot of it has to do with it's like, oysters are very high in protein. So you can, they say you can eat 2 dozen oysters and get enough protein to like replace a meal or something like that. Because there's that much crude protein per animal. I want to say it's like 12 grams of protein per oyster or something crazy. And, from that, the idea is it's not going to fill you up so you can drink more wine.
I gotcha. So it's not filling, but it does have
and it's something to do too. So it's like it's an interactive way to eat too. You're eating with your hands. You're eating something that was alive prior to shucking it. So there's all these different aspects that people are very attracted to about eating oysters with wine.
So for on land though too, in terms of agritourism, the wine industry leads the way far in a way, right? With weddings, with everything else too. So it's kind of great. People are getting out to farms, even if it's not, in the dirt so much.
Right, yeah.
People aren't going out and learning farming practices. It's much more focused on that vinification than the viticulture. But it's an interesting thing because it does draw the industry out. It helps educate people. So what kind of things have you been doing and do you plan to do around agritourism or the interaction of getting people out here?
Well, yeah. So I, particularly for myself, I grew up in the Charlottesville-Crozet area, which is at the foothills of Blue Ridge, which still extends into the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And, not many people know how important oysters are for the ecosystem as far as filtration, because it all comes around to us, and oysters, I forgot to mention this, but they're also keystone species. So like in reef systems, the oysters are the base of the food chain. So, that they're allowing all this filtration, they're creating habitat for these animals to actually live and thrive. And then on top, they just kind of, that booms the menhaden production. So there's more menhaden from the more oysters in the water, more menhaden, more striped bass. It's a full circle of life as far as like having something as simple as an oyster that just filters water and creates habitat to, a fin fish that's actively swimming around in the watershed.
So it's a huge building block in the keystone.
Exactly. But then, particularly for me, I'm doing these events up in the Charlottesville area, working with vineyards and breweries up in that area. It's it's a way for me to sell my product directly, but it's also a huge outreach as far as like getting people to get, excited about oysters and be a part of the oyster community, or even the restoration aspects of it. And what I mean by that is, all the oysters I sell at my events, I have all the customers bring the shell back to me, and I do a shell recycling program. And that shell recycling program is so important because, for the oyster wild populations, the oysters, without that shell, they don't have any clean substrate to adhere to. So, oysters are hermaphroditic in the water column. So in a reef system, you have oyster here. One's going to produce sperm, one's going to produce egg. And then they do that in what's called broadcast spawning. So they all release their gametes at the same time. And in the water column, they have about, once the eggs and sperm are introduced in the water column, they fertilize each other. And at that point, there's a larval stage. And then that larval stage has about 7 to 14 days to attach to some clean substrate. And if that larvae doesn't attach to anything, it dies. And then you have no oysters. So that's why it's extremely important to have shells. For every oyster you eat, you should put back in the water, pretty much. So there's like this saying, don't chuck that shell. And the idea is that to like, don't throw the shell in the trash can or your garbage disposal. Take it to your local dump that has a shell recycling bin, or give it to your oyster farmers.
I love that. And, it's funny, too, because I've heard things, too, about wineries. Somebody was asking me about that, too, during a separate interview, but about, and I asked you about this, too, but bring them to wine. And are they using them because, great for soil?
Yeah.
Too. But it's kind of funny. So it sounds like
it's a very great resource in general because it's, full of, different viable minerals that, pH the buffer, that it acts as a pH buffer for soil, and then also better drainage. And then, historically people used to put them in driveways, and it's like, oh, it was pretty to have an oyster shell driveway. But now it's like, if you do that, you almost go to jail kind of thing.
Oh, really?
No,
No, I can't, but it's so... But it sounds like top priority, though, is get them back to the water.
Yeah. And
that's where they belong, but it also helps with the ecosystem. And then, if you're using it for soil and other things, and then last on that list at the very, very bottom is use it for aesthetic purposes for your yard or for your driveway.
Or people paint shells and, make the little trinkety, like, name tags for weddings or something like that,
I have seen that. I used to go out in California, used to go abalone diving as a kid. And same thing, I think that has gone by the wayside.
We used to go short picking all the time for them.
Yeah, but people overdid it.
Oh, yeah.
Go up to measure, and it's kind of a lot like that.
And they got the Russian mafia involved in it. No, see.
Okay.
Up in Northern California, there's all kinds of stuff with that, yeah.
Really?
Yeah, there's this one guy that got caught for poaching, and he went to, it was like a $100,000 fine or something crazy, and he had to do jail time. And he went to jail for it.
But in terms of, and we kind of touched on this, so for agritourism, you're going out to these wineries and breweries, you're able to be in person and be there too. Are you doing anything in terms of bringing people out to the farm?
Yeah. So one of the aspects that I want to get into as far as the ecotourism of oyster farming is to get people to my site here. Cause I'm right on the end of a point, and we, have Annapoison Creek on the right. And then to the left, we have Chesapeake Bay. Very historical area. This site here used to be a steamboat landing back in the day. So, and if you dig underneath the ground just a little bit, it's just nothing but oyster shells and old fishing nets, because of how it still is a working waterfront, but has been for 100 years at least. So there's that aspect of it, but then also it's so important to do these outreach stuff for the oyster specifically, because people don't, they spend hundreds of dollars on them in restaurants eating them. They don't really know where it's going or what they're doing with this. But, it's so, I can't stress how beneficial it is for the ecosystem, but then also for the communities of these like small areas of Chesapeake Bay, particularly because as far as economy goes, like Chesapeake Bay oysters are, one of the higher, higher sources of,
generate.
Exactly, especially for seafood. But then also it falls under the agriculture department because we're actually putting these animals in the water and growing them ourselves and taking them out.
What obstacles are you excited about coming up?
Yeah, so it's farming at its finest too. So, in this industry I've been in for, over a decade, and I've probably killed 1 million oysters as well, learning how to grow oysters. And that's just from, it's farming at its finest. So you do things once and it doesn't work like that, you don't do it again, kind of thing. But as far as like the actual grow out, my goal is to be a boutique oyster farm that has a true farm to table experience. So you're meeting with the farmer, you're meeting with the chefs, and then you're having all this kind of come together as far as just the educational outreach of it. I got my background in fisheries biology, and I think restoration is, everything as far as, my goal is to produce a good oyster with the farm to table experience, but then also have a huge restoration conservation side behind it. So like my business card, it's not like oysters, highest quality, best oysters in the world kind of thing. It's aquaculture, conservation, and restoration. And those things all together is essentially like why I do what I do. And that's essentially what I've created down here, So with my events, not only all the restaurants I work with, I do the shell recycling program. So I bring, give or take, 6 to 10 bushel baskets with me, take all the shells from the restaurant, and I essentially put them in my pile that I have around the building here, which we'll take a look at. But in the 4 years of owning my business and doing these farm to table experiences, I've collected, the shell pile is 20 feet by 12 feet or something, and it sits 4 feet high.
It's enough.
Yeah, and I've opened every single one of them. So
I love it. I think that's all the time we got right now. Cool. We want to get to do some shooting some B-roll. Thank you.
Yeah.